I have 3 tips that I want to share with you on how to simplify the square root. However, these 3 tips you can also use for the cube root as well as the 4th root and higher. But to keep things simple and moving on, let's go and take a look on how you can make simplifying square roots easier, faster, and hopefully a little bit more enjoyable. Now, the first thing you absolutely have to know is your square numbers. Now, you don't need to know every square number, but I think knowing at least up to 15 is going to be very important. All right, these numbers are so important because we can all take the square root of them, right? The square root of any of these numbers is going to be an integer. So the first thing that I want you to focus on is try to find the largest of these numbers that evenly divide into your radicand. Don't do the first number you recognize, do the largest of these numbers that evenly divide into radicand. So for example, 288 is a pretty big number. It could be divisible by quite a few of these numbers, but if I look at the largest number that is divisible out of this list, I recognize it's just 144 divided by 2. So I can really speed along my process if I know these numbers and I can immediately see if they're divisible by my radicand. So now I can break this up into 144 times 2. Now 144 is a square number, right? So again, I can break this up into square root of 144 times the square root of 2, which is going to be a 12 times the square root of 2. The next tip I'd recommend doing is using the power rule and using the product rule. Now, I know a lot of us know that the square root of 16 is equal to 4, but it also sometimes might be helpful just to rewrite the square root of 16 as the square root of 4 squared. Because again, what we're doing is we're looking for the inverse operations of the square root and squaring, which again just gives us this 4. Now, this is helpful when we're dealing with numbers, but it's actually even more important when we're dealing with variables raised to a power. So for instance, the square root of x squared we know is just going to be x. However, what about when I have the square root of x to the 8th power? What do we do here? Now, there's a couple different ways we can do this. We can use the product rule and we can rewrite the square root of x to the 8th. And in terms of x squareds, we can rewrite this as a x squared times x squared times x squared times x squared. So if you're having trouble with this, go back to the product rule, because again, what does the product rule say? The product rule says whenever you're multiplying exponents with the same base, you add the powers. 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 equals 8. However, we know that we can now take the square root of each of these separately. And so I can take the square root of x squared times the square root of x squared times the square root of x squared times the square root of x squared. So if you get confused, use the product rule. It works. It's going to be helpful for you to understand exactly what you're doing and how to get the answer. However, I think the power rule is really where you're going to want to spend your attention, but there still is a mistake that you can make when doing the power rule. So please pay attention here. When I have the square root of x to the 8th, a lot of times students will say, well, you know, if I need to rewrite that as squared, I can rewrite that x squared to the 4th power. But the problem is we can't take the square root and 4th power are not inverse operations. So you didn't do the power rule incorrectly, because x squared to the 4th power is x to the 8th. However, our goal in this case is to get the square root and squared. We want the highest power to be squared. So all we simply need to do is rewrite this. We just need to rewrite this as the square root of x 4th to the squared power. Now you can see the square root and the square are going to undo each other, and we're going to get an x to the 4th, which is the exact same thing I got using the product rule. Now, the last tip I don't really like to give as a tip because it's not going to make this faster or easier. However, I always tell students, if you're struggling and you are, you're just not able to get the answer, or something's coming up, then please go back to the basics. When you first learned how to simplify radicals and you first learned how to break down numbers, we did prime factorization. Go back to the basics. So let's say I have the square root of 288 times x to the 8th, and you're using those previous 2 tips and you just can't get the right answer. Well, what can you do? You can break down these numbers into their prime factors. And again, remember, the square root means that what number multiplied by itself. So anytime you have pairs of either variables or numbers, you can pull those out of the square root. So let's go ahead and break this down the prime factorization way. So the first thing I recognize is 288 is going to be even. So I can go ahead and divide that by 2. So if I divided that by 2, I would have a 2 times a 144. And again, you can just keep on breaking this down, right? If you're like, having a brain fart and you can't think through this, then say, all right, well, what's 144 divided by 2? And you could say that's a 72 times 2. And then you could say, well, that's going to be a 36 times 2. And this is going to be an 18 times 2. And that's going to be a 9 times 2. And then this is going to be a 3 times 3. Then we can do the same thing with x to the 8th. Now with x to the 8th, I can actually just rewrite this as x multiplied by itself 8 different times. So let's go now rewrite this whole prime factorization here. So I have a 3 times 3 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. And then let's list out all the x to the 8th. So that's going to be x times x times x times x times x times x. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So again, this isn't making life faster, but hopefully if you need to get to this right answer, it's going to help you out. Now, again, we can take the square root of anything that we have pairs of. So you can just go ahead and circle those values. So all of these values I can take out of the square root. So I don't have another pair for this 2, so I'm going to leave it under there. And then I have the x, and I have another pair of x, and I have another pair of x, and another pair of x. So if everything I've taught before is not making sense, you can always rely back on this method. So every pair, I'm just going to rewrite on the outside. So 3 times 2 times 2 times x times x times x times x, and that's going to be times the square root of 2. Now we can just go ahead and simplify this. So 2 times 2 is 4, times 3 is going to be a 12, and then x times x times x is x to the 4th and square root of 2. So if you want more examples of me doing this either the slow way or the fast way, check out my examples down below, or go ahead and check out the next video I have for you right here.